Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the final Wild Writers Series event in partnership with Vertebrate Publishing. My name is Ross Brannigan. I am the Engagement Officer for the John Muir Trust. We're the organisation who are dedicated to the experience, protection and enhancement of wild places such as the ones I'm sure you will hear about this evening from our speaker, Alex Roddie. This event has been organised by the John Muir Trust. If you would like to support us, then please feel free to at johnmuirtrust.org/donate. Thanks to everyone who has donated for this event and paid for a ticket, because thanks to you, we've raised over £500 for the John Muir Trust and its work. So that's really amazing, and thank you to everybody for the generosity there. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. The chat is currently open and will be closed very shortly whilst Alex is speaking. It will reopen again just before the Q&A. So keep your questions held on and you'll be able to ask them then. Alex is going to be talking for about 45 to 50 minutes. So you'll have plenty of time to come up with questions, I'm sure. And also just to make you aware, this event is being recorded. If you just keep your microphones and your cameras off, then you won't be recorded for the meeting, which is all good because I don't think you can make yourself put your video on anyway. So tonight, very exciting, we have Alex Roddie, who is an outdoor writer and editor, speaking to us about his, I was going to say latest, but he has just pipped himself at the post with his own latest book. But he's going to be speaking about one of his newest books, The Farthest Shore, Seeking Solitude and Nature on the Cape Wrath Trail in Winter. It's a very lovely book. I highly recommend it myself. You're able to buy it from Vertebrate Publishing's website with a 25% discount code, which will be sent to you all after this event. So keep your eyes out for that. So Alex is going to be speaking to us tonight about this adventure along the Cape Wrath Trail and some of his observations on wild places. He's got a fantastic talk lined up for you, and I'm very excited to hear it as well. Alex, if you want to pop your camera on, that'd be great. We can see the man himself. There he is.
Hi.
Hello. Alex is obviously, he's a writer. He's written plenty of other books. He is the editor of Sidetrack magazine. He's a contributing editor for TGO magazine. He's a climber, mountaineer, hiker, runner now. He's dabbling in it. And yeah, this will be a really great evening. So Alex, I'm going to say a little bit less and I'm going to pass it on to you to say a little bit more. So thanks very much. And I'll see you all in about 45 minutes. Over to you, Alex.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Ross. Now I'll just share my screen. Here we go. Share. And I'll just play. There we go. Yep, so thanks very much to Ross, and also thank you to the John Muir Trust as well for the opportunity to speak to you all. I'm really thrilled. Now, as Ross says, my book, The Farthest Shore, is about hiking the Cape Wrath Trail in winter. It was published by Vertebrate Publishing in September last year, and I launched it at the Highland Bookshop in Fort William, which is a great place to launch a book about a big walk in the West Highlands. I've done a few talks about this particular book now. And if you've seen any of my other talks, you'll be aware that I talk quite a bit about the solitude and social media angle behind the walk, because that was quite an important element. Part of the goal was to disconnect myself from the internet for an extended period, because I was suffering from anxiety at the time. And I wanted to learn how much of that was to do with my relationship with the internet, the amount of time that I spend online. But I feel like I've spoken and written about that aspect quite a lot recently. So tonight I'm going to be focusing a little more on the nature that I saw, the wildlife, wildness in general, and what I observed about the changing climate in the Highlands. It's also really a story about expectations versus reality. as you'll see. So the Cape Wrath Trail is really what the book is all about. Now, if you're into your long distance walking or your hill walking in Scotland, you may well have heard of it. It's commonly regarded as the most challenging of the kind of established long distance routes in the UK. And I use the word route deliberately because from the name Cape Wrath Trail, you might be forgiven for thinking it's a way marked path with signposts, trail markers of some kind. But it's not at all like that. It's not like the Pennine Way or West Highland Way or any number of other routes. You are free to make up your own route, really. The only defined characteristics are that it starts in Fort William, treks through the West Highlands for about 240, 250 miles and finishes at Cape Wrath, which is the northwesterly point of the Scottish mainland. Now, there's paths for some of the way, and a lot of the rest of it is off path, and lots of kind of compass in hand navigation, heather bashing, bog stomping, all the good stuff really for Scottish hill walking. And this is what makes it so compelling, I think. No two Cape Wrath trails are the same. There's no official route. You can use one of the variants that have become established over the years, or you can make up your own trail. And I've hiked it twice now. So 2015 in June was my first hike of the Cape Wrath Trail, and it was a pivotal turning point for me. It was the start of my obsession with long distance walking. It was also the start of my kind of transformation towards a more lightweight backpacker. So I cut down a lot of pack weight. I learned a lot about myself, how to move for long periods through the Scottish landscape. And it was so good that I decided to go back and do it again. I'd always fancied the idea of a really long distance trail in winter. Now, I love winter in the Scottish Highlands. I'll mention why in just a moment. But on the map to the left there, you'll see two different routes. This is the map that was published in my TGO magazine article about my 2019 trip. The green route is pretty much the route that I took in summer 2015, and the red route is my February 2019 journey. Now, you'll notice that I started at Ardnamurchan Point. So you could argue that it wasn't technically a Cape Wrath Trail because it didn't start at Fort William. But I wanted to explore Ardnamurchan a bit because I'd never really spent that much time there. And also Ardnamurchan Point is more or less the westernmost point of the Scottish mainland. I think the official westernmost point is a little bit further away. So kind of the symmetry of it appealed to me, westernmost to northwesternmost, lighthouse to lighthouse. So that's the route. And, what about winter in the Highlands? So winter in the Scottish Highlands is my favorite season. So I was lucky enough to live in Glencoe for 3 years after I graduated university. I graduated with a degree in computer science in 2008, was at a loss of what to do. So someone suggested, get a job behind the bar at the Clackagan in Glencoe, and I did, and I went and lived there. And I was there during the winter 2009-2010, which was an exceptional winter, a lot of low temperatures, a lot of snow, and spent every spare minute on the hill, really, climbing and walking with my brother James, who was there at the time, and my friends in Glencoe. And these kind of really good experiences on Scottish mountains in winter, they never really leave you. Some of my experiences in that winter still count among the very best days of my entire life, easily up there in the top 10, top 5 hill days. And it's just the simplicity of a mountain in winter, it's rendered down to its simplest forms. All the kind of the texture and the extra colors are stripped away, and you're just left with the kind of the white and the blue. And this obsession with winter in the Highlands, it can be a fickle thing, really, because of course winter isn't always like this. Many winters are just wet and kind of damp and windy, as we've experienced this year. But having done a lot of climbing and hill walking, I started to wonder, what would it be like to do a long winter's journey in the Highlands. And this is where the expectations versus reality thing kind of really kicks in, because of course the Cape Wrath Trail doesn't head up to the high summits, it doesn't go over the Munros, it stays at a lower level. So it's never going to be quite like that for the whole period. And although people have hiked it in genuine full-on winter conditions before, I did realize that whatever my experience was, it wasn't going to be quite like this. But there were other factors as well during planning. So one of the logistical challenges for any Cape Wrath Trail, summer or winter, is that there are many rivers that you have to cross. And most of them don't have bridges. And even in summer, if you have a spell of wet weather, these rivers come up very quickly. They can be very challenging to cross. In winter, with the likelihood of more rain, possibly snow, this risk is magnified. So I was concerned about this. And the area with the most rivers on the Cape Wrath Trail is Knoydart. This is a very beautiful area. It's fantastically worthwhile to hike through, but it can be quite challenging. So on the left, you'll see a picture of the Karnick Bridge. This bridge was removed in 2018 because it was unsafe. And at the time when I was planning my trip, no replacement bridge had been put in. So I realized I would have to ford this river. And I worried a lot, actually, in the planning stages about what I would do. And I decided to plot this alternative route, which went to a much higher level, Bialach and Gal, I think about 733 meters. And I went and did a reconnaissance route in December 2018 just to check it out. And it was fine, but I did wonder what it would be like under heavier snow cover. And, I spent a lot of time just obsessed with the minutiae of the logistical planning at this point. And it was really a key source of anxiety before the trip set off. And just to briefly discuss gear as well. So you'll see the pack that I carried there on the left. It really did weigh a ton. So base weight, and that's minus your food and your water and your fuel, which are consumables, was around about 15.5 kilos. And you're looking at around about 25 kilos fully loaded. Now, there had been a big dump of snow a few days before I set out, so I didn't really know what to expect in terms of conditions. And of course, on a route of that length, you're going to get everything. You're going to get a bit of everything. I was advised snowshoes may be required, so I took them from the start. They added a fair chunk of weight, and they were really awkward to carry. And in addition, I was testing a bunch of kit for TGO magazine. I was doing a big comparative review of outdoor food. So I had to package up food and send it on to various different places along the trail that were going to accept resupply boxes. So there's a lot more planning involved than a summer trip. And, just getting to the start point felt like a long distance trail in itself, to be perfectly honest. But I did get there eventually. So 6th of February 2019, I stood on the foreshore at Ardnamurchan Point, and all the lovely snow that had fallen over the previous days was gone. It had all melted. There's a big thaw on. A gale was blowing spray into my face. And to be honest, I immediately felt overwhelmed. The pack that I was carrying was monstrously heavy. My boots were rubbing from the start. And Cape Wrath felt a very, very long way away. And I couldn't imagine myself hiking all the way there. Already from the very first mile, I was thinking, well, how am I going to fail? How is this going to end, and when? It didn't feel good, to be honest. There was the kind of immediate assumption that something would go wrong, and it started with gear failures. So this looks like an idyllic spot, and it really is. This is Sandwood Bay, beautiful place in Ardnamurchan. The camera angle's a little bit deceptive there because it looks like this kind of wilderness, but of course there's not really any genuine wilderness in Scotland. There's plenty of wild land, plenty of wildness, but there's a village just out of shot from this picture, and Ardnamurchan, there's people everywhere, very friendly, wonderful people for the most part, but due to Scotland's laws regarding wild camping, you can camp wherever you like in places like this, as long as you're responsible. So wild camping was a big part of my journey. But the tent that I took with me, now this didn't work out so well. I was sent it to review for the magazine. normally with big ticket items like this, I like to receive them with a good amount of time so that I can be sure I trust the item before I head on the trip, head out on the trip. But with this one, it turned up, I think 2 or 3 days before leaving, and I had no chance to test it at all, apart from pitching it in the garden. So this was the first time I'd used it in anger, and it didn't work. The idea behind this tent, it's a single skin design. And if you know your camping gear, you'll know that normally single skin tents suffer from horrendous condensation. And the design idea behind this one is that a special breathable fabric would prevent condensation from forming, in theory. In practice, it literally didn't work. So I don't want to trash the reputation of the brand or the model, because other people I know have used them and perfectly successfully. So the conclusion we came to after I consulted with the brand afterwards is that this was a faulty sample. But that didn't really matter to me at the time. The fact was that I was stuck with a tent where, you know, it rained and water was coming through the walls. Either that or the condensation was just so heavy. But either way, my sleeping bag was getting soaked. So that first night it got wet. Second night it was saturated. And of course, even though it's not sub-zero temperatures at this point, it's not a good place to be, you know, walking through the Scottish Highlands in winter with a sleeping bag that you can't get dry. Not really ideal. So I contacted my wife and I said, look, can you send up my spare tent, send it to my brother James. He's joining me at Glenfinnan in a few days. We'll figure it out when we get there. So I had to make my way to Glenfinnan with this soggy sleeping bag and a tent that didn't work, and having to kind of bail the tent out every night. You know, it was like Lake Windermere in there. And I spent a lot of time road walking when I should have been up in the hills, just kind of feeling sorry for myself in the atrocious weather and the constant gales that came in. So it must be said at this point, I was not paying much attention to the wildlife or the nature all around me. I was completely caught up in my own little world, in my own concerns, which of course is not what I wanted to be doing there. That's not why I was there. But I did make it to Glenfinnan eventually. And this is Corryhully Bothy. And Bothies are a wonderful part of UK outdoor culture. I think they're probably my favourite part. They're these shelters in mountain country that anyone can use. They're maintained by the Mountain Bothies Association. There's this code of conduct that people adhere to when they stay in Bothies. It's all about mutual respect, you know, mutual support, looking after the Bothy, looking after each other. And I've spent many a pleasant evening in Bothies sharing a dram with, you know, like-minded walkers, talking about rubbish, you know, making new friends very quickly. And I had a couple of days to spend at Corryhully while I was waiting for James to come and join me. Met up with a couple of guys called Mike and Lewis, who were doing a walk through Knoydart, and it was their first time in a Bothy, actually, so they were blown away. We made a start on the whiskey that the estate manager had kindly left behind, and I think it was after 10 p.m. that evening, the door opened again and this young guy came in looking pretty knackered, as I recall, and he kind of looked at us and said, well, maybe I'll head on to the next Bothy then. And we persuaded him to stop and have a drink with us and talk about what he was doing. And it turns out he was hiking from Land's End to John O'Groats via the Cape Wrath Trail, 17 years old. I was very impressed with what he was doing. We got to talking and he found out that I'd already done the Cape Wrath Trail. So he was asking me a lot of questions about the terrain ahead and so on. And I quickly had to adjust the level of my advice, because I realized that, you know, he had his head screwed on the right way. It was really interesting talking to him, actually, his perspective on it all. But as you can see in the picture, the weather did improve. There was a brief weather window, clear skies, temperatures dropped, the rain turned to snow, and Mike Lewis and I planned a day in the Munros above Corryhully the next day. So I think it's Sker Thulm and Sker Corrican, a couple of nice mountains. And I thought, you know, I'm going to get a bit of the winter that I've come here to experience. And I did. Up into the mountains, and winter was there. You know, winter was back. It was, you know, it was as good as I expected. Of course, it wasn't on the kind of continuous Cape Wrath Trail, but I got to use my snowshoes a bit. I got to use ice axe and crampons, and I just remember feeling just very grateful that I'd at least got to experience some of it. So I'll read a short passage from the book here, page 49. A time might come, I realised then, when a person could no longer stand near a Scottish summit and marvel at the fleeting beauty of sastrugi in a wind that decorated every stone with feathers of rime ice, a point when shifting baselines would erase this wonder along with all the others already lost in time. So this is when I really started to think about the changing nature of winter in the Highlands on this particular trip, and shifting baselines. So this is a concept from ecology in which our perception is of what is normal in nature, in the abundance of wildlife. It's subject to perception shifts over time. So, we think back to what we experienced as children, and we consider that normal, although that's already a highly depleted state from some previous baseline years or decades before. And the experience of winter in the mountains, I think, is also subject to shifting baselines. I'd already experienced it in only a few short years. Winters were becoming wetter, windier, less snow. Good winters for mountaineering do still come along, don't get me wrong, but there's definitely changes happening. So I resolved to be grateful for the experiences that I was granted, the experiences that I could actually experience, and to stop chasing that ideal of perfection, because I knew that I might not get any more winter on this trip. And as it turns out, I didn't. There was a big thaw that came in that night after coming down to the Bothy, huge thaw. Most of the snow melted. I joined up with my brother James. He'd driven over from Inverness, near where he lives. He brought my spare tent and a resupply box. I gave him my snowshoes because he'd looked at MWIS and the forecast, and he'd said, winter's gone for the time being. You're not going to need your snowshoes anymore. So I gave them to him with great relief because I didn't have to carry them anymore. And we headed into Knoydart. So he was joining me for a couple of days, partly to experience a bit of life on the trail, but also partly to shoot some images for TGO magazine. Because when you're trekking by yourself, it's very difficult to take good photos of yourself. And, these are the images that appear in the magazines quite often. So I did carry a tripod, but it's very difficult faffing around with self-timers and so on. And I was quite concerned about river crossings, as I've already mentioned. And I was worried that the snow melt would make them very serious. But as it happens, it was one of those cases where the rivers go up quickly and then they go down quickly. So this is the first river crossing after crossing over from Corryhully. And James actually made me do it twice to get the photo. But it really wasn't that bad. To be honest, it was worse when I'd done it in June 4 years before. So that was a bit of a relief. But we did have a conversation about what to do about the Karnick River crossing. And I'd been leaning towards going up and over my Bialik that I'd planned. And James said, look, big dump of snow followed by a thaw, north-facing Bialik at over 700 meters. Are you sure it's a good idea from an avalanche risk perspective? And I hadn't really been thinking about that, to be honest. I'd just been worrying about river crossings. But when you put it like that, I realized I've got to go for the river. So that's what I did. And to be honest, it was a doddle. It was such a moment of relief when I got to the River Karnick. So this is a little bit upstream from where the bridge used to be. And it's this nice, wide, flat, pebbly crossing, barely ankle deep, just an easy splash across. And it felt like a real turning point for me. So immediate sense of relief. I hadn't realized quite how much I'd been stressing about this particular crux point, how much I'd been worrying, if I'd have to camp for a couple of days on the near side of the river to wait for levels to go down or anything like that. And once on the other side, my entire outlook changed, really. I stopped looking inwardly quite so much, and I started looking at where I was, at the surrounding landscape far more, because I realized that I'd overcome this great big barrier that, to be honest, was mostly in my head. So Knoydart, it's a beautiful place. If you've ever been to Knoydart, you'll know it's extremely special. But it's also a very sad place once you learn a little bit about its history. It's a land of ruins. You can't miss them. There's ruined crofts, ruined shielings, the remains of townships. It used to support a much greater population than it does now. It was always a hard place to live, it must be said. But the vast majority of the population were either forcibly cleared by landowners, or left after the clearances and after, settlements kind of decayed. And yeah, it's really a story of tragedy. I think that the land no longer works for as many people as it used to, and it also no longer works as well for nature as it used to. Because of course, current systems of land use are large in the Scottish Highlands, with a few exceptions, are largely based on deer stalking, kind of high intensity, lots of herbivores that eat the vast majority of trees before they get the chance to grow. But in places where the deer can't get to, such as in the right of this picture, if you can see, I'm not sure if you can, there's birch trees growing up out of the crags. So yeah, I started to observe a lot more. And it's a very rugged landscape as well. You've got these cataracts, crags everywhere, following these ancient stalking paths and drove roads over through the glens. It's a remarkable experience. And of course, change is happening in Knoydart as well. So this is looking up at Larven, one of the major peaks. And I believe I'm right in saying that you can see part of the John Muir Trust property here, where a mixture of tree planting and natural regeneration is bringing back a much more healthy ecosystem. So you can see in places where another way is possible. Just requires time and patience, and it does require money as well, and just the will and the vision to do it. But yeah, there's definitely a sense as you walk through Knoydart that there's so much more that the place could be. But the next section, exiting Knoydart, there's a wonderful section of trail alongside Loch Horn. So I didn't really enjoy this as much as I could have the first time I did it, because the weather was terrible. And although it's only, I think, a 7-mile stretch between Barrisdale and Kinloch Horn, it felt really hard at the time. It looks kind of flat on the map, but there's more up and down than you think. But this time there was a nice little kind of lull in the weather, and it started to feel quite mild. And I was treated to this lovely little otter sighting. So this otter and a couple of others kept poking their noses up above the water and looking at me and kind of following along and poking their noses up again. It was really quite special. There was that sense of curiosity. So yeah, from Kinloch Horn, things became more challenging again. So I crossed over to Shield Bridge, which was my first real pit stop. Stayed at the Kintyre Lodge Hotel. They had another resupply parcel for me. And the weather took a real turn for the worse again. So the challenge in this middle section, which was, Shield Bridge to Torridon, really was just dealing with the relentless rain and wind. So it wasn't desperately cold, 3 or 4 degrees, maybe something like that. But I did have a bit of a brush with hypothermia on this stage, to be honest. Now, it was quite a long day between Shield Bridge and the bothy at Mulbury, which is a wonderful bothy in a fantastic stretch of countryside. But it's also quite a long day. Off the top of my head, I want to say it's about 17 miles. So when you're carrying a big pack at that time of year, it is a long day. And I had it in my head, I wanted to get all the way to Mulbury. So I wasn't in the mood for stopping to camp before I got there. But you have to go up quite high. You pass this enormous waterfall called the Falls of Glomac, which is a very impressive place. And then you descend this gorge. And I'd been slogging uphill quite rapidly. I'd been kind of feeling quite warm. So I'd taken off my mid layer. I was just wearing base layer and waterproof in the sluicing rain. And I was feeling warm enough. But when I got up onto the kind of exposed moor near the falls, the wind came in, horizontal rain, and I was freezing cold in no time at all. But I made the foolish mistake of not wanting to take my jacket off and open up my rucksack and get my fleece out and get everything soaked. I was just like, right, I'll just let body heat carry me forward. But descending the gorge, it's quite slippery and treacherous, and you've got to watch where you're putting your feet. And I managed to move quickly enough to generate enough body heat. So by the time I got back down to the glen here, I was absolutely frozen, barely moved my hands. So I had a word with myself, put my fleece on and kept going. And to be honest, I really should have stopped to camp and just, made some hot food. but I just kept on. And one of the things about Mulbury that they don't tell you is that there's a river crossing directly outside of the bothy. So normally, you'll have kind of half an hour or an hour or something on a bothy stage before, between river crossing and getting there. So you'll have a chance to dry off a bit, or maybe just even drip dry a bit, but not this time. You've got this knee deep wade and then the bothy's right there. So this is my gear explosion inside Mulbury with all my stuff hanging up. You might just about be able to see my socks hanging over a lit stove in a desperate attempt to dry them. Not a high point of the trip, it must be said, even though Mulbury is wonderful. But my spirits were raised by looking through the Bothy book, which is the record that exists in most bothies, where people can write down who they are, where they've been, what they're doing. And I saw a message from my friend Skye that the young lad doing Land's End to John O'Groats, and he was doing well. He got through Knoydart. He dealt with the river crossings. It was really great to read something from him in the book, particularly as he was the only other Cape Wrath Trail through hiker I was aware of doing it in February. So that really buoyed my spirits. But the bad weather continued until I got to Torridon. And at Torridon, I met up with Chris Townsend, who I'm sure many of you will either know or have heard of. He is a very experienced long distance walker, a very experienced outdoor writer. He's been active for several decades now. And he's a friend of mine. We've worked together on a number of projects, including TGO magazine. So we met up in Torridon with the plan to spend a few days together. This is at Torridon campsite, the little free site near the youth hostel. And we were just standing around chatting rubbish about gear, I think, when I noticed a tick on my dry bag. Now, normally you expect to see ticks, or at least I, at the time, expected to see ticks kind of roughly late April to early October. Ticks are nasty little parasites that can transmit diseases, but here was one on the 19th of February, and it was a real surprise, a real wake-up call. I've heard that, in fact, they've been spotted as early as January now. So there you go. But you can see the equipment that I had was kind of a mixture of lightweight stuff and heavyweight stuff. So the tent that Hannah had sent up and the bivy bag, really kind of summer lightweight kit, because that's all I had available to replace the faulty tent. But the next day I wanted to take a day off from the Cape Wrath Trail because, again, the weather was awful. So Chris and I decided to do an easy day walk up into the Benet National Nature Reserve. I think this track is called the Woodland Trail. Now, this is a very special area. This has been the site of a long-running conservation and rewilding project. Again, a mixture of planting and natural regeneration, I believe. And the effects have been remarkable. The tree cover has really come back, and you walk up through this wonderful forest filled with pines, kind of dripping with lichens and mosses. It's really spectacular. And you can break up kind of onto the open hillside above the pines, and you can see this natural looking tree line, which you can't really see in many places in Scotland. I think there's only a couple of other places I can think of where such a thing can be seen. And it's particularly a contrast when you compare it to the other side of the loch, where there are very few trees. And talking with Chris about this project was really inspiring, because he hadn't visited the place for 20 years, and the changes that he'd noticed were absolutely dramatic. And he was saying how much he was looking forward to finding out how much it would improve in the coming decades. Just hearing his perspective on rewilding in Scotland and conservation, how far it's all come, it makes you realize that baselines can shift in a positive direction as well. So yeah. The next day we continued along the Cape Wrath Trail. And this is Chris looking happy in the rain. Now we'd gone around the back of Leigach, one of the mountains of Torridon, and this is the path just before it climbs up towards Corryvich Veacha, which is a very impressive corrie, which unfortunately we did not see because of the low cloud base. I still haven't seen into that corrie. But one of the interesting things about this section of the trail is that after you leave the corrie, the path completely disappears, and you're basically left to contour around the northern side of Benet, around about the 600-meter contour for a number of miles. And it's one of the most challenging sections for navigation, and also it's quite strenuous as well. It's heathery ground, lots of bogs, lots of boulders. It's also one of the best sections on the trail, it really is. But the interesting thing here is that the first time I'd passed that way in 2015, there was no trace of a path whatsoever. However, on this trip, Chris and I both noticed little bits of paths here and there that kind of, we followed for a bit and they'd fizzle out. And I thought, well, maybe they're deer tracks, or maybe they're desire lines caused by other walkers coming that same way, because most of the guidebooks, they recommend sticking to around about that contour. It's pretty much the most logical route. And I was aware that as well, I'd written a lot about the Cape Wrath Trail in the intervening years. And I worry about my impact as an outdoor writer. Is my net impact a positive or a negative? When we promote wild places, what happens? Is the increased traffic a bad thing? Can it be a good thing? So Chris and I had a conversation about this, and I always find it very illuminating talking to Chris about any of these subjects, because of course he's considered these things for many years. And Chris pointed out that actually, as outdoor writers, we play a crucial role, and anyone who writes about the great outdoors or shares their experience, really, because wildland is threatened as never before. Development, climate change, biodiversity loss. It's not enough to just let it be, and if you do just let it be, then what's to stop big businesses or governments taking advantage of it? So if people don't love these places, that they're not going to protect them. And I'd never really looked at it in that way before. I kind of knew it on an intellectual level that people had to care about wildness, but where does that care come from? And it comes from people sharing their stories. It comes from people being inspired to visit them themselves. So of course there's always a balance to be struck. You can't over promote somewhere endlessly, but it did help to kind of settle my perspective on that. And this is a good example of the terrain from Corrie onwards. Wonderful wild landscape, really is. It's this amazing tessellation of water and rock for miles. I highly recommend going to explore in that big area around the back and just kind of wandering about without any particular aim, perhaps. I think it will be very, very rewarding. But we had a wild camp, so you probably can't quite see Chris's tent, but we camped down by the river, and Chris had to head back to Torridon the next day, and I continued. So the weather did improve. It became very spring-like, almost summery, if I'm honest. And every year in spring, I go through this metamorphosis as a hiker, I suppose you could say. So in the winter, I'm in my kind of winter mountaineering mode with my big boots and my ice axe and my heavy pack and dry bags galore and everything. And then in the spring, I emerge from my chrysalis as an ultralighter. So the trail shoes come out and the Cuban fiber tarps and and all that stuff, and I start to look at my gear lists a bit more obsessively and everything. And normally this kind of hits in about late March, early April, but on this trip it hit while I was on the Cape Wrath Trail theoretically in winter, carrying a winter pack pretty much and wearing big clomping mountaineering boots. And it was not a very good place for this urge to hike bigger miles and to go faster and lighter. It was not a great place for that at all. But I found myself unable to resist. So I was wanting to do 20-mile days, 25-mile days, but my complaining feet and joints had other ideas. But there was definitely a conflict between those two styles of hiker as I carried on. Now this section is fantastic. You walk beneath Anchalak, so that's looking up at Anchalak there. And as you can see, winter really was not in evidence. I've seen more snow on these mountains in May, probably in June, if I'm honest. You could climb any of the Munros in this entire area without any winter gear whatsoever. I did speak to other walkers saying, they'd planned this trip for years, and And yeah, they came up and it was all in summer conditions. But anyway, I stopped off at the Forest Way bunkhouse near Inville Ale, which I really recommend, by the way, by a guy who's really knowledgeable about hiking in the area. He took in a supply box for me. And I carried on along the Glendookery section. So this is a stage I hadn't done before, because the first time I went up north towards Ullapool to resupply. But this time I didn't need to, because I'd picked up a resupply box. So I thought, I'll crack on and I'll enjoy this section. And I really did enjoy it, actually. It looks very, very wild if you look at it there, this big wide open landscape, but there are signs everywhere. Again, like I mentioned in Knoydart, signs of prior human habitation, signs of also prior wildness. So down by the river, I noted a number of ruins that I passed. And also there was this enormous bisected peak cliff where some deluge from some savage previous storm had carved out the bank, and there were just the remains of these massive trees crumbling directly into the river, centuries or perhaps even thousands of years old. So again, you've got evidence of people that used to live in this landscape, and evidence as well of greater wildness. And this only increased as I passed through the area. And in fact, later on, after I finished the trip, I was looking up old maps of the area from centuries before, and a variety of townships dotted this entire plain. There used to be quite a lot of people living here, and now there's just nobody. But the interesting thing about this section is the gorge of the Dookery. So you follow this gorge along the right bank for quite a while. And as you can see, it's filled with trees. So you've got birches, you've got rowans, and they're mostly in places where they're protected from the deer. A wide variety of other plant life as well that I saw. So again, you've got this situation with these ruined crofts, ruined sheilings on the bank, and these hidden enclaves of nature in places the deer can't get to. And then wherever the deer are, there's nothing. Well, I mean, there is wildlife, it is still a valuable habitat, but it could be so much more. But I found myself getting a little bit lost on this stage and stumbling down this bank towards the stream. And yeah, I was stood there. I was standing there on the beach, and I sensed the presence of a dipper behind me. And I looked, and the dipper was there. And I'm not sure how I sensed it, but I did. And it was a real moment of connection and of realization. I wasn't sure at the time exactly what had been communicated to me, but I did powerfully sense the importance of noticing. If my head had been down with my own, looking at my phone, or obsessed with my own interior worries and anxieties, I would never have seen that dipper. I would never have known there were dippers along that river. And it really planted the seed of the idea in my mind that noticing is the root of it all. You can't learn about something and respect something if you don't notice it. You can't love something if you don't notice it. So for me, it was a very important lesson. A moment of realization. So I kept walking, and in the ascent stage, which is wonderful, I bumped into Sky again. He was doing around about the same kind of average pace as I was. He'd been doing very big days, actually, but he was having foot problems, so had to take a bit of time off every now and again. And I found myself really admiring Sky and what he was doing as we spoke. He was actually funding his trip by selling hiking gear on eBay, and he had big ambitions for other long distance trails he wanted to do. But he was telling me how much he enjoyed hiking the trail in winter, how much more solitary it was. There were no other hikers, no midges, better kind of quality of light when you do have good weather. And I found it very difficult to communicate to him the winters that I'd experienced in the past, when this entire landscape would have been transformed. And again, it's a shifting baseline, I suppose, even just in a few years. But he wanted to press on to the next bothy at Glen Cowell, and I wanted to deliberately slow down and enjoy this this next section because I knew it was going to be fantastic. So I decided to have a wild camp before I got to the Bialik. So this is, I think it's Bialik na Hui. My pronunciation isn't quite right, I don't think, but it's above Inchnadamth and probably the best wild camp on the trip. You can see my tent set up quite clearly there. Just a thin bivy bag over a winter sleeping bag, which was overkill. Winter sleeping bag rated to -12. Did not use it to anywhere near its capabilities, but also my clomping big mountaineering boots and 70-litre pack. I do recommend, by the way, the insulated trousers I was carrying. Any insulated trousers, wonderful luxury item when while camping in winter, even if you do want to pack light. So the descent into the Assynt backcountry is one of the very finest sections. This is the last real high point on the trail, both literally and figuratively, I suppose. I was really wary of hiking too fast, so I dawdled. I spent time gazing in lochans and staring at stones, and yeah, it was wonderful. I noticed a shift in myself. I was able to kind of tame the impatient ultralighter. Yeah, I walked past the highest waterfall in Britain. I think it's Isa Cúil Alwyn, and I made it down to Glen Calbothy, where I bumped into Skye again. He was actually still in his sleeping bag. He was feeling a bit tired. He'd had a big day the previous day, really. I made sure he was okay. I encouraged him to take things a little bit more slowly. And, I said, maybe we'll meet up at the next bothy. But again, my impatience did get the better of me. So the next bothy, Glen Dhu, is not that far along from Glen Cal, and it's a fantastic bothy. But when I got there, it was still early in the day, and I thought, well, I'll just do a few more miles and I'll camp. But the only place I could find to camp was this awful tussocky pitch, and a slope next to a stone wall covered in old bracken straw. And as I was pitching my tent, I noticed ticks on my jacket, ticks on my gear, ticks on the inside of the tent, ticks everywhere. And I lay there in my sleeping bag, zipped into my bivy bag, because I didn't have an inner tent in this tent. It was just a bivy and a basically a shaped tarp. Hoping that there weren't any ticks kind of zipped in with me. I'd never seen that many ticks before in my entire life, at any time of year. I have camped on tick nests before, and it's not pleasant. I've seen maybe 30 or 40 at a time, but there must have been a couple of hundred. It was absolutely absurd. That's the only way I can describe it. Worst camp of the trip by a long way. So that taught me to be impatient.
Alex,
now,
just a quick thing, Alex. I don't know if you're touching your microphone or something like that, but just there's a bit of like rustling or whatever every so often. Just with it just sounds like there's a popping noise. Okay,
no worries. It might be the keys that I'm pressing on the keyboard. I try not to do it hard. Okay, so this is the this is really the final high point of the trip. This is Sandwood Bay. So this is another John Muir Trust property. Very, very special place. Wonderful beach. It has this kind of middle of nowhere wilderness look about it when you see it in pictures, but in fact it's not very far from the nearest village. It's a relatively easy walk to get there, and in summer, it's a popular spot for dog walkers and picnickers, and quite rightly so. But it had that remote feeling as I walked along the beach. So I'm always a little bit wary about using that word remote with regards to the Scottish Highlands, because nowhere's remote compared, for the people who live there. But it had that kind of edge of the world feeling. And as I was walking along the beach, I saw this object poking up out of the sand. And I really couldn't tell what it was from a distance. My mind was kind of grappling with all the, is it a standing stone? Is it a massive piece of driftwood? But I realized that it was this colossal skull. And it really was one of these moments of profound mystery magic. As the only way I can describe it. So as a child, I was obsessed with the novels of Ursula Le Guin, fantasy novels, particularly the Earthsea novels about this world governed by magic, this archipelago. And the third book, The Farthest Shore, is about this kind of creeping evil that works its way over the lands of Earthsea. And the hero Ged, he makes his way to the beach at Celador, the farthest shore on the edge of the world, and there he finds the bones of the dragon, this dragon rising up out of the sand, and it felt like an echo of that moment. But of course, it's not really a dragon. I later found out I believe it's a northern bottlenose whale that had been stranded there. And of course, whale strandings are a massive problem around the UK. It's one of these things that nobody really knows exactly what's causing them. It's thought there are many underlying causes. So, pollution, just all the general plastic in the oceans, the possibly noise pollution from ships, just all the kind of accumulated kind of clutter of the human world. It's thought that it contributes towards whale strandings. And that year in 2019, a large number of whales were stranded around the UK coastline. So the skull was this focal point for many of the ideas that had been kind of swirling around in my head for a while about shifting baselines, about the massive changes that are happening to the landscape, to the climate, to the degree to which we've reduced the amount of nature in the landscape. And yeah, it really helped me to finish the trip with a greater sense of what my responsibility is towards the natural world. And it was a turning point in my relationship with nature as well, because after I came back, I became far more interested in wildlife, in bird watching than I'd ever been before. And I think, again, it comes down to noticing more. But I did reach the end. So after crossing Cape Wrath itself, 2nd of March, I reached the Cape Wrath Lighthouse, mile 299. Angela, who works there, made me a massive cooked breakfast and coffee, opened up the Ozone Cafe, especially for me. She'd not seen anyone for a few days, but it does get busy over the summer actually there. And I spent the last night in Cervig Bothy, which is just a few miles along from there. I believe it's the northernmost bothy in the UK, in this wonderful little bay looking out to the sea. And I had it to myself. I had the stars overhead, the sweep of the lighthouse. And yeah, it was really, really magical. And yeah, quite a fitting way to end my trip, I think. And really, though, the full lesson didn't hit until the following year, because of course we all experienced the COVID lockdowns, and in early 2020 I was locked down in the Lincolnshire Wolds where I live, which is a long way away from the mountains, and it's a long way away from what you might consider any wild landscapes. But there's nature here, and I really took the lessons of my Cape Wrath trail back with me, and also as well the Haute Route Pyrenees that I did in summer 2019. Again, I applied those lessons there, and I noticed a lot more about the amazing abundance of nature that the Pyrenees has in comparison to the mountains of the UK. But for me, the thing that got me through lockdown was watching local nature, time spent in the meadow early in the morning, watching the barn owls hunt, and particularly this very special moment of connection with this young roe deer. She was only a few meters away. I was kind of wedged in a hedge with my telephoto lens, and yeah, we noticed each other, and she was completely calm, absolutely no fear, just lying there in the grass. And yeah, it felt like absolutely everything to me. And again, the power of noticing. I could have spent my mornings during lockdown having lie-ins or going for runs, which is, to be honest, what I'm mostly doing at the moment. I'm going out for runs in the morning, but it was nature that got me through. And that really, I think, is the final lesson of it all. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And yeah, I will happily take questions.
That is great, Alex. Thanks very much. I'm just going to add myself a spotlight. There we go. That was brilliant. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks everybody for listening. The chat is now open for questions, so feel free to fire away. Alex, I have one question. When and I think maybe some people might empathize with me when I say this. When I started reading the book, I felt very wet. And I was like, oh boy, it sounded pretty tough going. And I just wondered, anyone who's thinking of taking on like the Cape Wrath, I mean, 30% of people answered the poll and said that it's on the list. Do you have any tips for anybody on how to keep their gear dry, or how to go day to day and get your gear dry?
Yeah, well, so there's a number of approaches you can take to this. So on my first trip, I used a kind of belt and braces approach, which was dry bags inside the pack and a pack liner, pack cover over the top of everything. But the problem with that is that pack covers tend to catch the wind. So I had a lot of problems with my pack cover. It blew away a couple of times. The wind gets under it, everything gets soaked anyway. So dry bags are fantastic, or a big pack liner that you can stuff everything in, and also just take advantage of the bothies. There's loads of bothies along the trail, along the kind of established variants. Go in there, get a fire on, dry your gear out, even if just a bit. And also, the occasional B&B or hotel stop is allowed.
Yeah. I know. There's like, don't forego the humanly pleasures just for the sake of feeling miserable. I did enjoy that about the book. And you went through a lot of John Muir Trust sites, and it was really lovely to hear some of the stuff you had to say. And I mentioned everyone at the beginning, if you do want to support the trust, just go to johnmuirtrust.org/donate and help support what we do. And kind of that whole picture about the bigger thing around nature, biodiversity, climate change. One of the things you mentioned in the book is that you spoke to people who were local to the areas, and asked them how they felt about the fact that there wasn't that much snow. And a lot of them replied with, oh, it's great, it's meaning people are coming through. And I just wonder how that made you feel.
Well, to be honest, it was quite a complicated emotion, really, because of course, these people live there. So to a large extent, I kind of think, well, maybe their opinion has more weight than mine. As a visiting backpacker, I've got quite specific ideas about what I like the Scottish mountains to look like, and that involves loads of snow and ice. But I'm well aware, having lived in Glencoe even just for a few years, loads of snow and ice can be really inconvenient. So I completely sympathise with that point of view. But at the same time, I also find it concerning as well, because baselines do shift. Yeah, definitely.
We've got some good questions coming in, and a lot of compliments as well. A lot of people saying you tell a lovely story.
Thanks.
And really enjoyed it, and a really excellent talk, moving, poignant, and exciting, which is really good. And I think you've also convinced more people to go and do the Cape Wrath Trail, which is great. Ian Barden is asking, what would you do differently when you walk the trail again? Third time. You will walk the trail again, he's saying. And what would you do differently?
Yeah. I think I certainly will do it again. In fact, I've often said that it's one of the few long distance routes that I would quite happily do a third time. I would pick some of the more obscure variants. So I've taken a different route both times I've done it already, and I'd take different routes again. I'd try there's a route that goes much further east in the kind of Assynt section. I'd probably go that way. I'd maybe take in a couple more Monroes. And I might be tempted to fast pack it, in the summer. I'm getting more into fast packing, doing kind of a mixture of running and walking. So I might be tempted to do it that way. But that is the beauty of the trip. You can do it however you want, as many times as you want. In fact, I do know somebody who, I think he does it every year and he never gets bored.
It's a constantly changing landscape, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm sure you could spend a lifetime and never get bored of it. Sticking with the trail, Norman is asking an interesting question. He's saying the sense of pilgrimage is inherent in heading north. Would it ever be thinkable to do the CWT southwards?
Oh, that's an interesting one. It's always felt natural to me to do it northbound. And I tend to feel the same about other routes I've done in Scotland. So I did the Skye Trail a few years ago with my brother James. And I think that one is commonly done southbound, but again, it felt natural to do it northbound. But particularly with the Cape Wrath Trail, for me at least, the landscape kind of it comes to a crescendo when you're walking northbound. So you're walking towards greater wildness, and towards these more impressive landscapes to the north. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I do it southbound and find that it's just as rewarding. But yeah, for me, northbound feels like the natural way.
Yeah. Alison has just popped a question in, and actually you touched a lot on this concept of like repeopling landscapes. And obviously we've chatted a little bit about how the John Muir Trust would love to see more people engaging with these landscapes and more people living in them. It would just be great to see these places that have been inhabited re-inhabited. And Alison's talking about that you mentioned like 100-year-old maps that you were looking at these sort of like old sites. And what resource did you use for that? Your book apparently been on our wish list for a while. So Alison, use event 25 on Vertebrate Publishing's website and you get 25% off. But yeah, what resource did you use for that mapping?
Well, that's a good question. To be honest, I can't remember off the top of my head. I think I just kind of Googled it and looked at the first result that came up, although it may have been one of these websites that lets you overlay historical OS maps. In fact, I think it was, and you can pick OS maps as far back as you want. And I seem to recall another map that I looked at of the Glendukery area from the 16th century. Again, I'm afraid I can't remember exactly where, but it did show a lot of townships in that particular glen. So it is fascinating looking at historical maps and realizing how many more people lived in these places. And it's everywhere across the Highlands. It's not just the far northwest, it's the Cairngorms as well. It's everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Now the book is obviously not just full of words, but also full of really beautiful pictures as well. At least in the center section, some of the stuff people have seen in the slideshow at the start. But yeah, if you want to see some lovely images from the Cape Wrath Trail, get the book and you'll find them in the middle. And someone's asking what camera gear you used, but I'm also interested. How did you keep it dry? I mean, I'm going to stick with that.
Okay, so this is a big question. So at the time of my 2019 Cape Wrath Trail, I was using a Fujifilm X-T2 camera with a 16 to 55 millimeter lens, I think, and I had a lot of problems with it, to be honest. So at that time, I'd been shooting Fuji cameras for a few years, but the X-T2, even though it's theoretically a weather-sealed camera, so theoretically it should keep most water out, not being completely waterproof. I had various failures with it, and that was largely, I think, due to the fact that I just couldn't keep it dry. So I carried a shoulder bag, which had a waterproof cover that kind of slipped over the top. And I also kept the camera in a dry bag inside that as well. So again, it's the belt and braces approach, but it was just impossible. Whenever I took the camera out to take a shot, it would get wet. I tried to wipe it off, but over a number of days, it would just be wet all the time. And you get it out and there'd be water inside the viewfinder. And it was just impossible. I'm currently using an Olympus EM1 Mark III, which, to be honest, has been more reliable. But most decent cameras are good nowadays. But I would recommend a weather-sealed one for Scotland, most definitely.
Summer or winter.
Yeah.
There's a couple of people who are mentioning that National Library of Scotland online is a really great resource for old maps.
That may have been where I looked, actually, thinking about it. Yeah.
So that's a good thing to remember. Paul is asking a bit more of a broader question about advice on trying to get an outdoor book published. He's got a second question, but I'll let you kind of answer that one first if you have anything to mention there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in my case, I think in many cases, it's the right idea at the right time. I mean, I'd already built up a career as a writer in various magazines, and I had been writing book-length manuscripts for many, many years, most of them kind of terrible fantasy novels, a decade or more ago. But yeah, right idea at the right time. A personal connection with the publisher. So I happen to know John Barton. I said to him, can I come to the office and we'll have a chat about the idea? And it happened to fit in with their publishing lineup, and it happened to be an idea that he liked. So really, some kind of connections in the publishing industry, is always, I know it's difficult if you're starting from scratch, but again, right idea at the right time and just having a really clear idea of what you're writing. So if you can sum up the book in one sentence, so seeking solitude in nature on the Cape Wrath Trail in winter is a good kind of one sentence summing it up. Alternatively, self-publishing is a very valid option nowadays. I've worked with a lot of self-published authors. You have to do a lot more yourself. You have to pay for editing and cover design and so on. But yeah, a lot of authors I know see great success that way, and it's perfectly valid. So yeah, no right or wrong way to do it.
Grand. And then his second question is, how do you prepare mentally and physically for these kind of big trips? I imagine that, you don't often walk around with 25 kilos on your back.
No, and the physical preparation for the load carrying is something I must admit I never do. So I know you'll often see it in various backpackers handbooks saying, condition yourself by carrying rucksacks on your local walks and whatever. I never do it. So one thing I have done for several years now is a morning 5-mile walk every single day before breakfast. I'll get up and I'll immediately go outside. More recently, in the last few months, I've switched that to mostly running, but the principle's the same. Just, if you can make some form of exercise part of your daily routine, even if you don't live near the mountains. I mean, I live in the flatlands. The 5-mile route that I do, I think it has 40 meters of ascent, goes up to a 20-meter contour. Anything like that, it makes a massive amount of difference. I mean, in terms of mental preparation, again, I think I'm quite kind of naturally attuned to it. I like spending a lot of time by myself, and it's just putting myself back in the mindset of previous trips and knowing that I've got through situations before. It's if you've never been through that situation before, it's more difficult. But if you can think, oh well, I got through worse, a couple of years ago, that means a lot.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. I'm going to pick you up on that. That if you can sum up your book in one word, then that's brilliant, because seeking solitude in nature on the Cape Wrath Trail in winter, what to you is solitude?
Yes, so solitude is a big theme in the book, of course, and I wanted to find out what solitude means in the present day, because of course it's very difficult to find true solitude these days. Solitude isn't just being physically alone, it's being alone with your own thoughts. And of course, if you're a freelance editor and writer who works from home like me, your work is on the internet, you're constantly getting emails, you're constantly in communication with people. There's also social media to manage as well. And social media is very good at eroding solitude, and this entire kind of environment makes it difficult to find solitude if you want it. And I think that everyone needs a degree of solitude. I think it's different for everyone, but we all need a degree of solitude in order to kind of hear our own thoughts and know what we really think and believe. Because if you're constantly listening to what other people think and believe, it's very difficult to know what you think. So for me, solitude, to be honest, is really having the ability to switch off every now and then, even if it's just sticking your phone in airplane mode and going for a walk in the woods for an hour, that can be all you need. And just making a bit of space for your own thoughts where you're not listening to music or looking at emails or whatever, that's a big part of it.
Yeah, because I always thought it was quite interesting, and I often find it whenever I go to places and I want to kind of be alone in my thoughts and so on. But one of the things that makes an adventure really enjoyable is the people that you meet on it. And it sounded like, your interactions with Sky were really uplifting for you. And I wonder if you ever heard from him afterwards.
Yeah, we corresponded by email after the trip. He did finish his route. So even though he was feeling a bit under the weather at the Bothy when I met him, he finished, I think, a couple of days after me, and he completed. He's running a successful business on eBay selling outdoor gear. I think it's called Wild Sky Gear. So check him out. He's manufacturing lightweight equipment. Yeah, but yeah, you're right. More generally, the encounters I had with people on the trail were very uplifting. The time I spent with Sky, also with James and with Chris. solitude can make these genuine connections more valuable, I think, because, you know, you're not being constantly bombarded by kind of shallow connections all the time from people you maybe don't really know online. You can kind of focus on the person right in front of you in a way that it's difficult to in everyday life a lot of the time.
Brilliant. There was a question, I can't find it just now, but somebody asked about, obviously you've talked a lot about wild places and nature in this talk, and you've deliberately sort of assuaged from speaking too much on the social media front, and I appreciate that. But I just wonder, whoever it was who asked the question, sorry, I can't find it. What's your relationship like now with social media? You have a manifesto in the back of the book. Maybe you want to talk about that. But yeah, what have you changed about your relationship with social media now you've done the trip?
Sure. So the manifesto that I wrote in the back was pretty much just a list of simple points that you can do if you feel that your own relationship with social media it isn't quite right, if you feel that you could do with adjusting it, because, you know, of course, it's very easy to use online platforms to just kind of go with the flow and to not use them intentionally, because, you know, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. They are ad platforms, so they make money from our attention, so they're incentivized for us to spend as much attention as possible on them. And, you know, the points that I make are just, if you're vulnerable to that, if you think it does cause anxiety or any other mental health problems, just to be aware of it, and to seek that silence every now and again. And one of the key points that I make is to try, if it works for you, when you're actually out on the hill having your adventure, to try to make a bit of space between experiencing the thing and posting about it. So I'm not anywhere near as absolute about all this as I used to be. So before the trip, I was quite kind of anti-social media. I was thinking, you know, it's the source of all my problems. But after I came back, I was a lot more chilled about it. So I do post on social media quite a lot now. I find that I don't have an issue with it anymore because I'm using it more intentionally and I'm aware of the downsides and I can step away from it if I want to. But I do still like to give myself a bit of space if I can. You know, sometimes I'm on a project trip for one of the magazines working with a brand, and sometimes I'm required to go on social media during the trip, and obviously that's different. But if I'm just doing a personal adventure, I like to just stay offline, and then on the train home, I'll stick a bunch of Instagram stories up or whatever. And it's just giving that bit of a gap between experiencing it and sharing it helps to build my own perspective. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. Rory asks a question. You can decide to answer this if you like. And he said, I found in the book your journey with grief particularly important. You talked a lot about your father. Transitional seasons in our life are helped by physical journeying. Is there any more you want to say on that, kind of that concept?
Yeah, I completely agree. So my dad died a year before the trip took place, and it was a very difficult time. So he had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He did suffer quite badly, but he also he went through his illness with a great kind of a great grace as well. So he taught me an awful lot about how to kind of face the end of life with that kind of sense of grace and patience. But the actual first anniversary of his death took place when I was on the trip. And yeah, it made me, the whole journey made me feel a lot closer to my father, because I had, again, that space to think through a lot of these things that I hadn't really had the chance to think through in the year between his death and the walk, because I hadn't had these long periods of time by myself. You know, it'd just been a few days, and sometimes a few days isn't enough. Sometimes you need a couple of weeks or more just to let these thoughts percolate through to the surface. But yeah, I mean, I do owe my dad an awful lot. He got me into the outdoors. I think I'm increasingly taking after him now. I'm going grey in the same places above each ear. I'll end up looking like him in 20 years, I can tell. So yeah, I think for many people, the grieving process is definitely helped by a big walk. It certainly did for me.
Yeah, that's great. Just sort of staying on that for a moment, you do talk a little bit about, I thought your observation on mental health and the outdoors was really interesting. And you talk a little bit about people thinking like the outdoors is like just an immediate patch on mental health issues. I wonder if you want to just unpack that a little bit for people, and just talk about what your observation was on that.
Sure. Yeah. So it's an idea that you'll often see online, that if you're suffering from any kind of mental health problem, depression, anxiety, and so on, the idea is that getting outside and spending time in nature will help. And I've always kind of had a little bit of an issue with this, because of course there's an awful lot of evidence that time in nature can be tremendously helpful, but it's not as simple, I don't think, as get outside and everything will be fine. And I think that message can be quite damaging, because I know quite a few people where their relationship with the outdoors is complicated. I mean, my brother James, I mentioned his mental health problems in the book. He's spoken about it at length. He suffered from, well, he continues to suffer from depression, and he was hospitalized for an eating disorder when he was a teenager. And his route back into the great outdoors and his recovery involved an awful lot of risky solo climbing. Made him feel good, made him feel alive, but it was this quite destructive spiral that he had to break out of eventually. So adventure itself can be toxic. It can cause problems. And I've, particularly at the start of my Cape Wrath Trail, ironically, really, I was looking into the sources of my own anxiety, and I was spending a lot of time worrying about stuff. I was probably worrying about more than I'd worried in my everyday life on the first few days on the trail, resupply parcels and gear failures and God knows what else. And yeah, so I definitely, it's not a simple thing. Take what you can from your time in the outdoors, and it most definitely will help on some level, but don't beat yourself up if it's not an entirely positive experience, because it's more complicated than that.
I can imagine. No, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. Jack has thrown a couple of questions into the chat, and he's like, I'm a big fan of slow walking, meandering, and pay attention to tiny things as I go. I quite liked your anecdote on the dipper. That's really lovely. So did you ever feel that the need to constantly keep moving diminish your ability to pay attention to the little things along the way? Or was the mile crunching mindset a net positive for you?
That's something I think about quite a lot, because there is a conflict between these two aspects. And I think particularly on big routes like the Cape Wrath Trail, where you are constrained by logistical considerations, when you're going to run out of food, when you're going to run out of fuel. And I sometimes feel like when I'm in the mood to be slow and to notice more, I sometimes feel like I haven't thought ahead enough, and I haven't packed enough food and fuel to just let myself camp somewhere for 5 days and enjoy it. So yeah, there is a conflict there. I was quite conscious of that. There was definitely always that drumbeat of urgency, particularly towards the end of the trip, where I was feeling like doing bigger miles, and I had to consciously push back against that urge and make myself slow down. And I sometimes wonder whether long distance walking is the best way of experiencing the landscape like this. Sometimes it's been shorter trips that have been far, far better in that regard. 2 or 3 days in the Cairngorms without any particular agenda in mind, just with a tent and a bit of food, and just wandering around, seeing where I end up. They're often much better for taking my time and noticing more about my surroundings.
Mm-hmm. And kind of linked to that, I think it's Fiona asked, when you are walking solo offline and you're not focusing on the practicalities, where does your mind go?
Yeah. Like sometimes it varies. So I think it varies as well depending on how long the trip is. So on shorter trips, often I end up thinking about various topics that are connected to my everyday life, or I'll be thinking about ideas for books or writing, whatever. But I'll normally get to a point on a long walk, maybe it's a week in, maybe it's kind of 10 days, in which my thoughts become drastically simpler. And I think in the book I mentioned that my thoughts felt less like some fractured shard of the industrial world and more like a kind of river wash stone. And that's probably the best way I can describe it still, actually. My thoughts become simpler. and often I don't think about anything at all consciously. I'll just let my mind kind of blow empty. And I do feel myself kind of dissolve more into the surroundings when that happens. And that's when I'll be a lot more likely to kind of just sit under a tree and stare up into space and chill out. And one of the things I enjoy most about being in the outdoors, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a couple more questions before we finish up. And folks, if you did enjoy tonight, it's been wonderful having you all, and I hope you've enjoyed it. If you do want to get Alex's book, you can get it from the Vertebrate Publishing website, which I think is v-publishing.com, and use event25 to get 25% off the book. And yeah, support Alex, which would be great. And Alex, I just wondered, what was, do you think, the kind of the high point for you of the trail? I know it's a difficult question, but
I've been asked. I think I've been asked this every talk I've done about the trip, and I think I've given a different answer every single time. So, yeah, today I'm probably going to say the section around the back of Ben A in Torridon is going to be my favorite. Ben A is one of my favorite mountains. It's absolutely spectacular, and just that enormous sense of space, and the fact that you're you've got no path to follow, and you're looking at your compass or your GPS, and you're making your own way. And it really does sum up the entire essence of the Cape Wrath Trail for me. It's not easy, it's difficult, there's probably going to be kind of a bit blood, sweat and tears. So yeah, that's my favorite section.
I know, it's funny how the Torridon Munros, they're always kind of like, they are the centerpiece. And I've been around that back bit a few times and just been like, whoa, it's just vast landscape. You get a sense of like Ascent is coming when you're there. It's just this huge, vast area. Just a last question from me. If of the 30% of people who have the Cape Wrath on their list who are here tonight, what tips would you give for someone who is planning to walk the Cape Wrath Trail?
Right, so take it seriously, I would say, but don't let yourself be too psyched out. So it is a serious proposition for any backpacker, particularly if you haven't done any really long walks in the Scottish Highlands. But at the same time, it isn't an extreme expedition most of the time. If you do it in the kind of normal months, April through to September, more or less, most of the terrain is not as difficult as the terrain you'll find in a lot of Scottish Munros. It's more about the distance rather than the terrain right in front of you. So break it down into small chunks. Break it down to small chunks when you're actually on the trail, but don't overplan it too much. You probably don't need to send resupply parcels ahead in summer, because there are plenty of places where you can buy food. So you will need to carry food for several days, but don't overplan, and don't think it's this massive undertaking. A lot of experienced hill walkers and backpackers, that they'll be capable of doing it.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks everybody. You're all putting in some really lovely messages in the chat for us, which is great. If you want to give us feedback for this event, I'm sending an email out in the next 2 days, giving you an opportunity to give us your feedback, which would be great. And also in that email, there's a chance to support the Trust, to help protect some of the places that Alex talked about. You can become a member of the John Muir Trust. Like I say, we get people out into the outdoors, we get them connected to these places, help them love it more so they'll protect, and hopefully we can continue to repair and enhance them. Or if you're not ready, just feel free to donate. It would be wonderful to have your support. So without further ado, thank you very much, Alex. Thanks everyone else for joining us, and I hope to see you all at another event sometime very soon. Bye for now.